Module 3, Concessional versus Commercial and the Spectrum of Money. Picture the financing for that solar mini-grid we started with. In the final deal, there's a small grant from a climate fund, a cheap long-term loan from a development bank, an ordinary commercial loan from a local bank, and a chunk of money from a private company that owns a share of the project. 4 very different kinds of money, stacked together in one deal. To read any climate deal, you need to know what each kind is, what it costs, and why they're combined. That's this module. By the end, you'll understand 3 things. First, the spectrum of money from a pure grant at one end to commercial equity at the other, and the key terms along it, concessional, grant element, and equity. Second, who actually holds the money, public or private, domestic or international. And third, the big idea called billions to trillions, why leverage matters, and how several kinds of money get combined into what's called a capital stack for a single project. Let's build the spectrum from one end to the other. Think of it as a line. On the far left, the cheapest, softest money in the world. On the far right, the most expensive, most demanding money. As we move from left to right, the money gets more expensive for the recipient and more demanding in what it wants back. At the far left is the grant. A grant is simply a gift, money given that you never have to pay back. No interest, no repayment, nothing. For a recipient country, it's the best possible money and naturally the scarcest. Grants are the right tool for things that will never generate cash to repay a loan, a sea wall, a coastal early warning system, the planning study for a big project. If it produces no revenue, it can only really be funded by a grant, because there's nothing to repay a loan with. Remember that link from Module 2, no cash inflows, no ability to service debt, so grants are the natural home of adaptation and public goods. Move one step right, and you reach the concessional loan. Now, concessional is a word you'll hear constantly, so let's nail it. A loan is a sum you borrow and must repay, usually with interest, the fee you pay for borrowing. A commercial loan charges you the full market interest rate. A concessional loan is a loan offered on softer, kinder terms than the market would give you. It might charge a much lower interest rate, or give you far longer to repay, or let you wait several years before you start repaying at all, what's called a grace period. All of those make the loan easier on the borrower than a normal one. That softness, that gap between market terms and the kinder terms you're actually offered, is the concession. Hence, concessional. Let me make concessional concrete. Imagine the local commercial bank would lend your solar project money at 12% interest over 7 years, with repayments starting immediately. Now a development bank offers the same project a loan at 2% interest over 25 years, and you don't have to start repaying for the first 5 years while the project is being built and finding its feet. Every one of those differences, the lower rate, the longer term, the grace period, that waiting time before repayment begins, is worth real money to you. Together, they can be the difference between a project that collapses under its repayments and one that comfortably survives. That is what concessional means in practice, not a vague kindness, but specific, measurable softening of terms. There's a precise way finance people measure that softness, and it's worth knowing because it appears in real documents, the grant element. The grant element is the share of a concessional loan that is effectively a gift, expressed as a percentage. Think of it this way. A concessional loan is part real loan and part hidden gift, the gift being all the interest you're not being charged and the time you're being given. If a loan has a grant element of 40%, then, loosely, 40% of it behaves like a grant and 60% like a real loan. A pure grant has a grant element of 100%, it's all gift. A commercial loan has a grant element of 0, no gift at all. So the grant element is a single number that tells you how soft a loan is. The higher the grant element, the closer it sits to the grant end of our spectrum. If concessional loans are so much better for the borrower, why don't developing countries just take those instead of commercial loans or instead of grants? Why is there a spectrum at all, rather than everyone wanting the softest money? Because the soft money is deliberately limited, and it's rationed. Concessional money and grants come mostly from public sources, from donor governments and the funds they capitalize, and there's only so much of it. So it gets steered toward the cases that need it most, the poorest countries, and the projects that can't attract anything else. A middle-income country building a profitable wind farm may be told, you don't need scarce grant money, you can borrow commercially, save the soft money for the country that can't. So the spectrum exists because the money is scarce and must be allocated. The whole skill of the system is matching the right softness of money to the right project, using precious grants only where nothing else will work, and pushing commercial money wherever a project can bear it. Get that matching wrong, and you either waste scarce grants or you saddle a project with debt it can't carry. Let's keep moving right along the spectrum. Past the concessional loan sits the ordinary commercial loan, full market interest, no softness, grant element of zero. This is what a normal bank offers a normal borrower. And then, at the far right, we reach something different in kind, not just in price, equity. Equity is the concept from Module 2's world that trips people up most, so let's be really clear. A loan is money you borrow and must repay regardless of how the project does. The lender gets paid back whether you succeed or fail, as long as you can pay. Equity is different. Equity is an ownership share. When someone puts equity into a project, they're buying a piece of it. They don't get repaid on a schedule. Instead, they own part of the project and they earn a return only if it does well, through their share of the profits. If the project soars, equity investors can earn a lot. If the project fails, they can lose everything because owners get paid last after all the lenders. So equity is the riskiest money in the deal, and precisely because it takes the most risk, it demands the highest return. That's the risk-return law from Module 2, made concrete. Equity sits at the far, expensive, demanding end of our spectrum. So there's your line, from left to right: grant, concessional loan, commercial loan, equity. Softest and cheapest to hardest and most expensive. Whenever you look at a climate deal, you can now place each piece of money on that line. Now, the second thing to understand: who actually holds all this money. It helps to sort the world of money along two simple cuts. The first cut is public versus private, which we met in Module 1. Public money is government money, aid budgets, and the development banks and climate funds that governments own and fund. Private money is commercial, banks, companies, and big investors like pension funds and insurance companies, whose job is to earn a return for their clients. The second cut is domestic versus international. Domestic money is raised inside the country itself, its own government budget, its own local banks. International money comes from outside, from foreign donors, from the multilateral funds, from the development banks, from foreign investors. Put those two cuts together and you get a simple mental map. There's domestic public money, a country's own budget spent on climate. There's international public money, the grants and concessional loans from donors and funds, the stuff this course focuses on most. There's domestic private money, local banks lending to local solar companies. And there's international private money, the great ocean of global private capital that everyone is desperate to attract. Hold that four-box map in your head. Almost every actor we meet in later modules lives in one of those boxes. Let me ground each box with a picture from a single province, so it stops being abstract. Domestic public money is the line in the national budget that pays for the provincial government's own flood drainage works. International public money is the grant from the Green Climate Fund and the cheap loan from the Asian Development Bank that together fund the solar mini-grid. Domestic private money is the loan the local commercial bank makes to a village entrepreneur to buy solar home systems and sell power to her neighbors. And international private money is the foreign infrastructure investor who might, if the risk can be tamed, put equity into a portfolio of mini-grids across the country. Same province, four very different wallets, each with its own motive and its own price. A big part of your craft is knowing which wallet to knock on for which project, because knocking on the wrong one wastes months. You don't ask a profit-seeking foreign investor to fund a sea wall, and you don't burn a scarce GCF grant on something a commercial bank would happily finance. One more thing on this map before we move on, because it connects straight to the danger of debt. When soft money is scarce, and a country keeps filling the gap with loans, even concessional ones, the loans still have to be repaid, and they pile up. A country can borrow its way into a trap where servicing old debt eats the budget it needs for schools, clinics, and climate resilience itself. So matching the right softness of money to the right project isn't just tidiness. Give a poor country a hard loan for a project that earns no revenue, and you've handed it a burden, not a gift. This is why the poorest countries are supposed to receive grants and the very softest credits, not commercial debt, and why getting the match wrong can do real harm. We'll return to this debt problem in Module 10, but plant it here: softness must match the borrower's ability to repay. That last box, international private capital, is enormous, far larger than all the aid budgets in the world combined. Which brings us to the third and most important idea of this module: billions to trillions. The logic goes like this. The world needs trillions for climate action, as we saw in Module 1. But the public money available, all the aid and all the concessional finance together, is only in the hundreds of billions. The gap between the two can never be closed by public money alone. There simply isn't enough of it. So, the argument goes, public money must be used not to fund projects directly, but to unlock and pull in the vastly larger pool of private money. Public billions deployed cleverly to mobilize private trillions. That's the slogan, billions to trillions, and it's the reigning philosophy of institutions like the World Bank. The mechanism that makes it possible is leverage. Leverage means using a small amount of your own money to bring in a much larger amount from others. Here's how it works in practice, and it connects straight back to de-risking from Module 2. Suppose a private investor looks at our solar mini-grid and says, "Too risky, the returns don't justify it, I'm out." Now a development bank steps in and puts a small amount of public money in a special position, agreeing to absorb the first losses if the project underperforms. Suddenly, the private investor's risk has dropped sharply. Their required return drops with it, and now they're willing to come in with a much larger sum. A small slice of public money has just unlocked a large slice of private money. We say the public money leveraged or crowded in the private money. If $1 of public money brings in $4 of private money, we call that a leverage ratio of 4 to 1. This billions to trillions idea sounds almost too good to be true. Does it actually work? Is the private money really showing up? You're right to be skeptical, and honestly, the record is mixed. Where it works beautifully, especially in mitigation, in renewable energy in middle-income countries, where projects sell electricity and can genuinely attract private capital with a little help. But it has largely failed to deliver for the places and sectors that need it most, for adaptation, and for the poorest and riskiest countries, exactly where there's no revenue and the risk premium is highest. Private money crowds into the deals that were nearly bankable anyway, and stays away from the hard cases, which are the ones we most need funded. So leverage ratios can look impressive in aggregate while the neediest are left behind. This is one of the genuine, unresolved debates of the field, and we'll return to it squarely in the final module. For now, hold both truths: leverage is powerful, and it is not a magic solution, and where it fails, only grants and concessional money will do. Let me pull all of this together with the idea you'll actually see in project documents: the capital stack. A capital stack is simply the full set of different kinds of money layered together to fund one project. Picture our solar mini-grid again, now as a stack. At the bottom, a grant pays for the feasibility study and covers first losses. That's the softest money, doing the riskiest job. On top of that, a concessional loan from a development bank provides cheap, patient, long-term funding. On top of that, a commercial loan from a local bank. And at the top, equity from a private company that owns and operates the grid and earns its return from the electricity sales. 4 layers, 4 points on our spectrum, each doing the job it's suited for. The soft money absorbs the risk and funds what earns nothing. The hard money funds what can pay its own way. Arranging that stack well, the right money in the right layer, is the central craft of climate finance, and increasingly it's your craft too. So to bring it together, money sits on a spectrum from grants, which are pure gifts and the natural home of adaptation, through concessional loans, offered on softer-than-market terms and measured by their grant element, to commercial loans, and finally to equity, an ownership share that risks the most and demands the most. That money is held across 4 boxes: public and private, domestic and international, and the largest box by far is international private capital. Because public money can never cover the trillions needed, the strategy called billions to trillions aims to use public money as leverage to crowd in private money, which works well in easy cases and poorly in the hard ones. And in any real deal, several of these kinds of money combine into a capital stack, each layer doing the job it's built for. You now understand the money itself, its terms, its sources, and how it's combined. Next, we zoom out to the whole system that governs it, the global architecture of goals, funds, and institutions, and that's Module 4.